Chapter 15 of Ruth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Ruth by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 15. Mother and Child. "Here is a parcel for you, Ruth," said Miss Benson on the Tuesday morning. "For me?" said Ruth, all sorts of rushing thoughts and hopes filling her mind, and turning her dizzy with expectation. If it had been from him, the new-born resolutions would have had a hard struggle for existence. "It is directed Mrs Denbigh," said Miss Benson before giving it up. "It is in Mrs Bradshaw's handwriting." And, far more curious than Ruth, she awaited the untying of the close-knotted string. When the paper was opened, it displayed a whole piece of delicate cambric muslin, and there was a short note from Mrs Bradshaw to Ruth, saying her husband had wished her to send this muslin in aid of any preparations Mrs Denbigh might have to make. Ruth said nothing, but coloured up, and sat down again to her employment. "Very fine muslin indeed," said Miss Benson, feeling it, and holding it up against the light, with the air of a connoisseur. Yet all the time she was glancing at Ruth's grave face. The latter kept silence, and showed no wish to inspect her present further. At last she said in a low voice, "I suppose I may send it back again." "My dear child, send it back to Mr Bradshaw? You'd offend him for life, you may depend on it. He meant it as a mark of high favour." "What right had he to send it me?" asked Ruth, still in her quiet voice. "What right? Mr Bradshaw thinks I don't know exactly what you mean by right." Ruth was silent for a moment, and then said, "There are people to whom I love to feel that I owe gratitude which I cannot express, and had better not talk about. But I cannot see why a person whom I do not know should lay me under an obligation. Oh, don't say I must take this muslin, please, Miss Benson." What Miss Benson might have said if her brother had not just then entered the room, neither he nor any other person could tell, but she felt his presence was most opportune, and called him in as umpire. He had come hastily, for he had much to do, but he no sooner heard the case than he sat down, and tried to draw some more explicit declaration of her feeling from Ruth, who had remained silent during Miss Benson's explanation. "You would rather send this present back?" said he. "Yes," she answered softly. "Is it wrong?" "Why do you want to return it?" "Because I feel as if Mr Bradshaw had no right to offer it to me." Mr Benson was silent. "It's beautifully fine," said Miss Benson, still examining the piece. "You think that it is a right which must be earned?" "Yes," said she, after a minute's pause. "Don't you?" "I understand what you mean. It is a delight to have gifts made to you by those to whom you esteem and love, because then such gifts are merely to be considered as fringes to the garment, as inconsiderable additions to the mighty treasure of their affection, adding a grace, but no additional value, to what before was precious, and proceeding as naturally out of that as leaves burgeon out upon the tree. But you feel it to be different when there is no regard for the giver to idealise the gift, when it simply takes its stand among your property as so much money's value. Is this it, Ruth?" "I think it is. I never reasoned why I felt as I did. I only knew that Mr Bradshaw's giving me a present hurt me, instead of making me glad." "Well, but there is another side of the case we have not looked at yet. We must think of that too. You know who said, 'Do unto others as ye would that they should do unto you.' Mr Bradshaw may not have had that in his mind when he desired his wife to send you this. He may have been self-seeking, and only anxious to gratify his love of patronising. That is the worst motive we can give him. And what would be no excuse for your thinking only of yourself, and returning his present." "But you would not have me pretend to be obliged?" asked Ruth. "No, I would not. I have often been similarly situated to you, Ruth. Mr Bradshaw has frequently opposed me on the points on which I feel the warmest, am the most earnestly convinced. He, no doubt, thinks me quixotic, and often speaks of me and to me with great contempt when he is angry. I suppose he has a little fit of penitence afterwards, or perhaps he thinks he can pay for ungracious speeches by a present. So, formerly, he invariably sent me something after these occasions. It was a time, of all others, to feel as you are doing now. But I became convinced it would be right to accept them, giving only the very cool thanks which I felt. This omission of all show of much gratitude had the best effect. The presents have much diminished, but if the gifts have lessened, the unjustifiable speeches have decreased in still greater proportion, and I am sure we respect each other more. Take this muslin, Ruth, for the reason I named, and thank him as your feelings prompt you. Overstrained expressions of gratitude always seem like an endeavour to place the receiver of these expressions in the position of debtor for future favours. But you won't fall into this error." Ruth listened to Mr Benson, but she had not yet fallen sufficiently into the tone of his mind to understand him fully. She only felt that he comprehended her better than Miss Benson, who once more tried to reconcile her to her present by calling her attention to the length and breadth thereof. "I will do what you wish me," she said, after a little pause of thoughtfulness. "May we talk of something else?" Mr Benson saw that his sister's frame of mind was not particularly congenial with Ruth's, any more than Ruth's was with Miss Benson's, and putting aside all thought of returning to the business which had appeared to him so important when he came to the room, but which principally related to himself, he remained above an hour in the parlour, interesting them on subjects far removed from the present, and left them at the end of that time soothed and calm. But the present gave a new current to Ruth's ideas. Her heart was as yet too sore to speak, but her mind was crowded with plans. She asked Sally to buy her, with the money produced by the sale of a ring or two, the coarsest linen, the homeliest dark blue print, and similar materials, on which she set busily to work to make clothes for herself; and as they were made she put them on, and as she put them on she gave a grace to each, which such homely material and simply shaping had never had before. Then the fine linen and delicate soft white muslin, which she had chosen in preference to more expensive articles of dress when Mr Bellingham had given her carte blanche in London, were cut into small garments, most daintily stitched and made ready for the little creature, for whom, in its white purity of soul, nothing could be too precious. The love which dictated this extreme simplicity and coarseness of attire was taken for stiff, hard economy by Mr Bradshaw, when he deigned to observe it; and economy by itself, without any soul or spirit in it to make it living and holy, was a great merit in his eyes. Indeed, Ruth altogether found favour with him. Her quiet manner, subdued by an internal consciousness of a deeper cause for sorrow than he was aware of, he interpreted into a very proper and becoming awe of him. He looked off from his own prayers to observe how well she attended to hers at chapel. When he came to any verse in the hymn relating to immortality, or a future life, he sung it unusually loud, thinking he should thus comfort her in her sorrow for her deceased husband. He desired Mrs Bradshaw to pay her every attention she could, and even once remarked that he thought her so respectable a young person that he should not object to her being asked to tea the next time Mr and Miss Benson came. He added that he thought, indeed, Benson had looked last Sunday as if he rather hoped to get an invitation, and it was right to encourage the ministers, and to show them respect, even though their salaries were small. The only thing against this Mrs Denbigh was the circumstance of her having married too early, and without any provision for a family. Though Ruth pleaded delicacy of health, and declined accompanying Mr and Miss Benson on their visit to Mr Bradshaw, she still preserved her place in his esteem, and Miss Benson had to call a little upon her talent for fiction, to spare Ruth from the infliction of further presents, in making which his love of patronising delighted. The yellow and crimson leaves came floating down on the still October air. November followed, bleak and dreary. It was more cheerful when the earth put on her beautiful robe of white, which covered up all the grey naked stems, and loaded the leaves of the hollies and evergreens, each with its burden of feathery snow. When Ruth sat down to languor and sadness, Miss Benson trotted upstairs, and rummaged up every article of spare or worn-out clothing, bringing down a variety of strange materials. She tried to interest Ruth in making them up into garments for the poor; but, though Ruth's fingers flew through the work, she still sighed with thought and remembrance. Miss Benson was at first disappointed, and then she was angry. When she heard the low long sigh, and saw the dreamy eyes filling with glittering tears, she would say, "What is the matter, Ruth?" in a half reproachful tone, for the sight of suffering was painful to her. She had done all in her power to remedy it, and though she acknowledged a cause beyond her reach for Ruth's deep sorrow, and in fact loved and respected her all the more for these manifestations of grief, yet at the time they irritated her. Then Ruth would snatch up the dropped work, and stitch away with drooping eyes, from which the hot tears fell fast. And Miss Benson was then angry with herself, not yet at all inclined to agree with Sally when she asked her mistress why she kept mithering the poor lass with asking her for ever what was the matter, as if she did not know well enough. Some element of harmony was wanting, some little angel of peace, in loving whom all hearts and natures should be drawn together, and their discords hushed. The earth was still hiding her guilty front with innocent snow, when a little baby was laid by the side of the pale white mother. It was a boy. Beforehand she had wished for a girl, as being less likely to feel the want of a father, as being what a mother, worse than widowed, could most effectually shelter. But now she did not think or remember this. What it was, she would not have exchanged for a wilderness of girls. It was her own, her darling, her individual baby, already, though not an hour old, separate and sole in her heart, strangely filling up its measure with love and peace, and even hope. For here was a new, pure, beautiful, innocent life, which she fondly imagined, in that early passion of maternal love, she could guard from every touch of corrupting sin by ever watchful and most tender care. And her mother had thought the same, most probably, and thousands of others think the same, and pray to God to purify and cleanse their souls, that they may be fit guardians for their little children. Oh, how Ruth prayed, even while she was yet too weak to speak, and how she felt the beauty and significance of the words, "Our Father." She was roused from this holy abstraction by the sound of Miss Benson's voice. It was very much as if she had been crying. "Look, Ruth," it said softly. "My brother sends you these. They are the first snowdrops in the garden." And she put them on the pillow by Ruth. The baby lay on the opposite side. "Won't you look at him?" said Ruth. "He is so pretty." Miss Benson had a strange reluctance to see him. To Ruth, in spite of all that had come and gone, she was reconciled; nay more, she was deeply attached; but over the baby there hung a cloud of shame and disgrace. Poor little creature! Her heart was closed against it, firmly, as she thought. But she could not resist Ruth's low, faint voice, nor her pleading eyes, and she went round to peep at him as he lay on his mother's arm, as yet his shield and guard. "Sally says he will have black hair, she thinks," said Ruth. "His little hand is quite a man's already. Just feel how firmly he closes it." And with her own weak fingers she opened his little red fist, and taking Miss Benson's reluctant hand, placed one of her fingers in his grasp. That baby touch called out her love. The doors of her heart were thrown open wide for the little infant to go in and take possession. "Ah, my darling," said Ruth, falling back, weak and weary, "if God will but spare you to me, never mother did more than I will. I have done you a grievous wrong, but, if I may live, I will spend my life in serving you." "And in serving God," said Miss Benson, with tears in her eyes. "You must not make him into an idol, or God will, perhaps, punish you through him." A pang of affright shot through Ruth's heart at these words. Had she already sinned and made her child into an idol, and was there punishment already in store for her through him? But then the internal voice whispered that God was our Father, and that He knew our frame, and knew how natural was the first outburst of a mother's love. So, although she treasured up the warning, she ceased to affright herself for what had already gushed forth. "Now go to sleep, Ruth," said Miss Benson, kissing her, and darkening the room. But Ruth could not sleep. If her heavy eyes closed, she opened them again with a start, for sleep seemed to be an enemy stealing from her the consciousness of being a mother. That one thought excluded all remembrance and all anticipation in those first hours of delight. But soon remembrance and anticipation came. There was the natural want of the person who alone could take an interest similar in kind, though not in amount, to the mother's, and sadness grew like a giant in the still watches of the night, when she remembered that there would be no father to guide and strengthen the child, and place him in a favourable position for fighting the hard battle of life. She hoped and believed that no one would know the sin of his parents, and that the struggle might be spared to him. But a father's powerful care and mighty guidance would never be his. And then, in those hours of spiritual purification, came the wonder and the doubt of how far the real father would be the one to whom, with her desire of heaven for her child, whatever might become of herself, she would wish to entrust him. Slight speeches, telling of a selfish worldly nature, unnoticed at the time, came back upon her ear, having a new significance. They told of a low standard, of impatient self-indulgence, of no acknowledgment of things spiritual and heavenly. Even while this examination was forced upon her by the new spirit of maternity that had entered into her and made her child's welfare supreme, she hated and reproached herself for the necessity there seemed upon her of examining and judging the absent father of her child. And so the compelling presence that had taken possession of her wearied her into a kind of feverish slumber, in which she dreamed that the innocent babe that lay by her side in soft ruddy slumber had started up into man's growth, and instead of the pure and noble being whom she had prayed to present as her child to our Father in heaven, he was a repetition of his father, and like him lured some maiden, who in her dream seemed strangely like herself, only more utterly sad and desolate even than she, into sin, and left her there to even worse a fate than that of suicide. For Ruth believed there was a worse. She dreamt she saw the girl, wandering, lost, and that she saw her son in high places, prosperous, but with more than blood on his soul. She saw her son dragged down by the clinging girl into some pit of horrors into which she dared not look, but from whence his father's voice was heard crying aloud that in his day and generation he had not remembered the words of God, and that now he was tormented in this flame. Then she started in sick terror, and saw by the dim rushlight Sally nodding in an armchair by the fire, and felt her soft little warm babe nestled up against her breast, rocked by her heart, which yet beat hard from the effects of the evil dream. She dared not go to sleep again, but prayed, and every time she prayed she asked with a more complete wisdom, and a more utter and self-forgetting faith. Little child, thy angel was with God, and drew her nearer and nearer to him, whose face is continually beheld by the angels of little children. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Ruth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Ruth by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 16. Sally tells of her sweethearts and discourses on the duties of life. Sally and Miss Benson took it in turns to sit up, or rather they took it in turns to nod by the fire, for if Ruth was awake, she lay very still in the moonlight calm of her sick bed. That time resembled a beautiful August evening, such as I have seen. The white, snowy, rolling mist covers up under its great sheet all trees and meadows and tokens of earth, but it cannot rise high enough to shut out the heavens, which on such nights seem bending very near, and to be the only real and present objects. And so near, so real and present, did heaven and eternity and God seem to Ruth, as she lay encircling her mysterious holy child. One night Sally found out she was not asleep. "I'm a rare hand at talking folks to sleep," said she. "I'll try on thee, for thou must get strength by sleeping and eating. What must I talk to thee about, I wonder? Shall I tell thee a love story or a fairy story, such as I've telled Master Thurstan many a time and many a time, for all his father set his face again fairies and called it vain talking? Or shall I tell you the dinner I once cooked when Mr. Harding, as was Miss Faith's sweetheart, came unlooked for, and we'd nought in the house but a neck of mutton, out of which I made 7 dishes, all with a different name?" "Who was Mr. Harding?" asked Ruth. "Oh, he was a grand gentleman from Lunnon, as had seen Miss Faith, and had been struck by her pretty looks when she was out on a visit, and came here to ask her to marry him. She said no, she would never leave Master Thurstan, as could never marry. But she pined a deal after he went away. She kept up afore Master Thurstan, but I seed her fretting, though I never let on that I did.
for I thought she'd soonest get over it and be thankful, and after she'd be the strength to do right. However, I've no business to be talking of Mrs. Benson's concern. I'll tell you of my own sweethearts and welcome, or I'll tell you of the dinner, which was the grandest thing I ever did in my life. But I thought a Londoner should never think country folks knew nothing. And my word, I puzzled him with his dinner. I'm doubting whether to this day he knows whether what he was eating was fish, flesh, or fowl. Shall I tell you how I managed? But Ruth said she would rather hear about Sally's sweethearts, much to the disappointment of the latter, who considered the dinner by far the greatest achievement. Well, you see, I don't know as I should call them sweethearts, for excepting John Rawson, who was shut up in a madhouse the next week, I never had what you may call a downright offer of marriage but once. But I had once, and so I may say I had a sweetheart. I was beginning to be afeard, though, for one likes to be axed. That's but civility. And I remember, after I had turned 40, and afore Jeremiah Dixon had spoken, I began to think John Rawson had perhaps not been so very mad, and that I'd done ill to lightly his offer as a madam's, if it was to be the only one I was ever to have. And I don't mean as I'd have had him, but I thought, if it was to come o'er again, I'd speak respectful of him to folk, and say it were only his way to go about on all fours, but that he was a sensible man in most things. However, I'd had my laugh, and so had others, at my crazy lover, and it was late now to set him up as a Solomon. However, I thought it would be no bad thing to be tried again, but I little thought the trial would come when it did. You see, Saturday night is a leisure night in counting houses and such like places, while it's the busiest of all for servants. Well, it was a Saturday night, and I'd my baize apron on, and the tails of my bedgown pinned together behind, down on my knees, pipe-claying the kitchen, when a knock comes to the back door. "Come in," says I, but it knocked again, as if it were too stately to open the door for itself. So I got up rather cross and opened the door, and there stood Jerry Dixon, Mr. Holt's head clerk, only he was not head clerk then. So I stood, stopping up the door, fancying he wanted to speak to master, but he kind of pushed past me, and telling me somewhat about the weather, as if I could not see it for myself, he took a chair and sat down by the oven. Cool and easy, thought I, meaning himself, not his place, which I knew must be pretty hot. Well, it seemed no use standing waiting for my gentleman to go. Not that he had much to say either, but he kept twirling his hat round and round, and smoothing the nap on it with the back of his hand. So at last I squatted down to my work, and thinks I shall be on my knees all ready if he puts up a prayer, for I knew he was a Methody by bringing up, and he had only lately turned to master's ways of thinking. And them Methodies are terrible hands at unexpected prayers when one least looks for 'em. I can't say I like their way of taking one by surprise, as it were, but then I'm parish clerk's daughter, and could never demean myself to dissenting fashions, always save and except Master Thurston's, bless him. However, I'd been caught once or twice unawares, so this time I thought I'd be up to it, and I moved a dry duster whenever I went to kneel upon in case he began when I were in a wet place. By and by I thought, if the man would pray it would be a blessing, for it would prevent his sending his eyes after me wherever I went, for when they takes to praying they shuts their eyes, and quivers the lids in a queer kind of way, them dissenters does. I can speak pretty plain to you, for you're bred in the church like myself, and must find it out o' the way as I do to be among dissenting folk. God forbid I should speak disrespectful of Master Thurston and Miss Faith, though. I never think on them as church or dissenters, but just as Christians. But to come back to Jerry. First I tried always to be cleaning at his back, but when he wheeled round, so as always to face me, I thought I'd try a different game. So I says, Master Dixon, I ask your pardon, but I must pipe clay under your chair. Will you please to move? Well, he moved, and by I was at him again with the same words, and at after that again and again, till he were always moving about with his chair behind him, like a snail as carries its house on its back. And the great goppus never seed that I was pipe claying the same places twice over. At last I got desperate cross. He were so in my way, so I made 2 big crosses on the tails of his brown coat, for you see, wherever he went, up or down, he drew out the tails of his coat from under him, and stuck them through the bars of the chair, and flesh and blood could not resist pipe claying them for him, and a pretty brushing he'd have, I reckon, to get it off again. Well, at length he clears his throat uncommon loud, so I spreads my duster and shuts my eyes all ready, but when naught comed of it, I opened my eyes a little bit to see what he were about. My word, if there he wasn't down on his knees, right facing me, staring as hard as he could. Well, I thought it would be hard work to stand that, if he made a long ado, so I shut my eyes again, and tried to think serious, as became what I fancied were coming. But forgive me. But I thought, why couldn't the fellow go in and pray with Master Thurston, as had always a calm spirit ready for prayer, instead of me, who had my dresser to scour, let alone an apron to iron. At last he says he, Sally, will you oblige me with your hand? So I thought it were, maybe, Methody fashion, to pray hand in hand, and I'll not deny but I wished I'd washed it better after blackleading the kitchen fire. I thought I'd better tell him it were not so clean as I could wish, so I says, Master Dixon, you shall have it, and welcome, if I may just go and wash 'em first. But, says he, my dear Sally, dirty or clean, it's all the same to me, seeing I'm only speaking in a figuring way. What I'm asking on my bended knees is, that you'd please to be so kind as to be my wedded wife. Week after next will suit me, if it's agreeable to you. My word, I were up on my feet in an instant. It were odd now, weren't it? I never thought of taking the fellow, and getting married. For all I'll not deny, I had been thinking it would be agreeable to be axed. But all at once I couldn't abide the chap. Sir, says I, trying to look shamefaced as became the occasion, but for all that feeling a twittering round my mouth that I were afeard might end in a laugh. Master Dixon, I'm obliged to you for the compliment, and thank ye all the same, but I think I'd prefer a single life. He looked mighty taken aback, but in a minute he cleared up, and was as sweet as ever. He still kept on his knees, and I wished he'd take himself up, but I reckon he thought it would give force to his words. Says he, think again, my dear Sally. I've a 4-roomed house and furniture conformable, and £80 a year. You may never have such chance again. There were truth enough in that, but it was not pretty in the man to say it, and it put me up a bit. As for that, neither you nor I can tell, Master Dixon. You're not the first chap as I've had down on his knees afore me, asking me to marry him. You see, I was thinking of John Rawson, only I thought there were no need to say he were on all fours. It were truth, he were on his knees, you know. And maybe you'll not be the last. Anyhow, I've no wish to change my condition just now. I'll wait till Christmas, says he. I've a pig as will be ready for killing then, so I must get married before that. Well now, would you believe it? The pig was a temptation. I'd a receipt for curing hams, as Miss Faith would never let me try, saying the old way were good enough. However, I resisted. Says I, very stern, because I felt I'd been wavering, Master Dixon, once for all, pig or no pig, I'll not marry you. And if you'll take my advice, you'll get up off your knees. The flags is but damp yet, and it would be an awkward thing to have rheumatiz just before winter. With that he got up, stiff enough. He looked as sulky a chap as ever I clapped eyes on. and as he were so black and cross, I thought I done well, whatever came of the pig, to say no to him. 'You may live to repent this,' says he, very red. 'But I'll not be hard upon ye. I'll give you another chance. I'll let you have the night to think about it, and I'll call in to hear your second thoughts, after chapel to morrow.' Well now, did ever you hear the like? But that is the way with all of them men, thinking so much of theirselves, and that it's but ask and have. They've never had me, though, and I shall be 61 next Martinmas, so there's not much time left for them to try me, I reckon. Well, when Jeremiah said that he put me up more than ever, and I says my first thoughts, second thoughts, and third thoughts is all one and the same, you've but tempted me once, and that was when you spoke of your pig. But of yourself you're nothing to boast on, and so I'll bid you good night, and I'll keep my manners, or else, if I told the truth, I should say it had been a great loss of time listening to you. But I'll be civil, so good night." He never said a word, but went off as black as thunder, slamming the door after him. The master called me into prayers, but I can't say I could put my mind to them, for my heart was beating so. However, it was a comfort to have had an offer of holy matrimony, and though it flustered me, it made me think more of myself. In the night I began to wonder if I'd not been cruel and hard to him. You see, I were feverish like, and the old song of Barbary Allen would keep running in my head, and I thought I were Barbary, and he were young Jemmy Gray, and that maybe he'd die for love of me, and I pictured him to myself, lying on his deathbed, with his face turned to the wall, with deadly sorrow sighing, and I could have pinched myself for having been so like cruel Barbary Allen. And when I got up next day, I found it hard to think on the real Jerry Dixon I had seen the night before, apart from the sad and sorrowful Jerry I thought on a dying, when I were between sleeping and waking. And for many a day I turned sick when I heard the passing bell, for I thought it were the bell loud knelling, which were to break my heart with a sense of what I'd missed in saying no to Jerry, and so idling him with cruelty. But in less than a 3 week, I heard parish bells a-ringing merrily for a wedding, and in the course of the morning someone says to me, "Hark, how the bells is ringing for Jerry Dixon's wedding!" And all on a sudden he changed back again from a heartbroken young fellow like Jemmy Gray into a stout, middle-aged man, ruddy complexioned, with a wart on his left cheek like life. Sally waited for some exclamation at the conclusion of her tale, but receiving none, she stepped softly to the bedside, and there lay Ruth, peaceful as death, with her baby on her breast. "I thought I'd lost some of my gifts if I could not talk a body to sleep," said Sally, in a satisfied and self-complacent tone. Youth is strong and powerful, and makes a hard battle against sorrow. So Ruth strove and strengthened, and her baby flourished accordingly, and before the little celandines were out on the hedge banks, or the white violets had sent forth their fragrance from the border under the south wall of Miss Benson's small garden, Ruth was able to carry her baby into that sheltered place on sunny days. She often wished to thank Mr Benson and his sister, but she did not know how to tell the deep gratitude she felt, and therefore she was silent, but they understood her silence well. One day, as she watched her sleeping child, she spoke to Miss Benson, with whom she happened to be alone. "Do you know of any cottage where the people are clean, and where they would not mind taking me in?" asked she. "Taking you in? What do you mean?" said Miss Benson, dropping her knitting, in order to observe Ruth more closely. "I mean," said Ruth, "where I might lodge with my baby. Any very poor place would do, only it must be clean, or he might be ill." "And what in the world do you want to go and lodge in a cottage for?" asked Miss Benson indignantly. Ruth did not lift up her eyes, but she spoke with a firmness which showed that she had considered the subject. "I think I could make dresses. I know I did not learn as much as I might, but perhaps I might do for servants and people who are not particular." "Servants are as particular as any one," said Miss Benson, glad to lay hold of the first objection that she could. "Well, somebody who would be patient with me," said Ruth. "Nobody is patient over an ill-fitting gown," put in Miss Benson. "There's the stuff spoilt, and what not." "Perhaps I could find plain work to do," said Ruth very meekly. "That I could do very well. Mamma taught me, and I like to learn from her. If you would be so good, Miss Benson, you might tell people that I could do plain work very neatly and punctually and cheaply." "You'd get sixpence a day, perhaps," said Miss Benson. "And who would take care of baby, I should like to know? Prettily he'd be neglected, would he not? Why, he'd have the croup and the typhus fever in no time, and be burnt to ashes after." "I have thought of all. Look how he sleeps. Hush, darling." For just at this point he began to cry, and to show his determination to be awake, as if in contradiction to his mother's words. Ruth took him up, and carried him about the room while she went on speaking. "Yes, just now I know he will not sleep, but very often he will, and in the night he always does." "And so you'd work in the night and kill yourself, and leave your poor baby an orphan? Ruth, I'm ashamed of you. Now, brother," Mr Benson had just come in, "is this not too bad of Ruth? Here she is planning to go away and leave us, just as I, at least, have grown so fond of baby, and he's beginning to know me." "Where were you thinking of going to, Ruth?" interrupted Mr Benson, with mild surprise. "Anywhere to be near you and Miss Benson, in any poor cottage where I might lodge very cheaply, and earn my livelihood by taking in plain sewing, and perhaps a little dressmaking, and where I could come and see you and dear Miss Benson sometimes, and bring baby." "If he were not dead before then of some fever, or burn, or scald, poor neglected child, or you had not worked yourself to death with never sleeping," said Miss Benson. Mr Benson thought a minute or two, and then he spoke to Ruth. "Whatever you may do when this little fellow is a year old, and able to dispense with some of a mother's care, let me beg you, Ruth, as a favour to me, and a still greater favour to my sister, is it not, Faith?" "Yes, you may put it so if you like." "To stay with us," continued he, "till then. When baby is 12 months old, we'll talk about it again, and very likely before then some opening may be shown us. Never fear leading an idle life, Ruth. We'll treat you as a daughter, and set you all the household tasks, and it is not for your sake that we ask you to stay, but for this little dumb helpless child's, and it is not for our sake that you must stay, but for his." Ruth was sobbing. "I do not deserve your kindness," said she, in a broken voice. "I do not deserve it." Her tears fell fast and soft like summer rain, but no further word was spoken. Mr Benson quietly passed on to make the inquiry for which he had entered the room. But when there was nothing to decide upon, and no necessity for entering upon any new course of action, Ruth's mind relaxed from its strung-up state. She fell into trains of reverie, and mournful, regretful recollections which rendered her languid and tearful. This was noticed both by Miss Benson and Sally, and, as each had kind sympathies, and felt depressed when they saw any one near them depressed, and as each, without much reasoning on the cause or reason for such depression, felt irritated at the uncomfortable state into which they themselves were thrown, they both resolved to speak to Ruth on the next fitting occasion. Accordingly, one afternoon, the morning of that day had been spent by Ruth in housework, for she had insisted on Mr Benson's words, and had taken Miss Benson's share of the more active and fatiguing household duties; but she went through them heavily, and as if her heart was far away. In the afternoon, when she was nursing her child, Sally, on coming into the back parlour, found her there alone, and easily detected the fact she was crying. "Where's Miss Benson?" asked Sally gruffly. "Gone out with Mr Benson," answered Ruth, with an absent sadness in her voice and manner. Her tears, scarce checked while she spoke, began to fall afresh, and as Sally stood and gazed, she saw the babe look back in his mother's face, and his little lip begin to quiver, and his open blue eye to grow overclouded, as with some mysterious sympathy, with the sorrowful face bent over him. Ruth took him briskly from his mother's arms. Ruth looked up in grave surprise, for in truth she had forgotten Sally's presence, and the suddenness of the motion startled her. "Bonny boy, are they letting the salt tears drop on thy sweet face before thou'rt weaned? Little somebody knows how to be a mother. I could make a better myself. Dance, Thumbkin, dance, dance, ye merry men, every one. Ay, that's it. Smile, my pretty. Any one but a child like thee," continued she, turning to Ruth, "would have known better than to bring ill luck on thy baby by letting tears fall on its face before it was weaned. But thou'rt not fit to have a baby, and so I've said many a time, I've a great mind to buy thee a doll, and take thy baby myself." Sally did not look at Ruth, for she was too engaged in amusing the baby with the tassel of the string to the window blind, or else she would have seen the dignity which the mother's soul put into Ruth at that moment. Sally was quelled into silence by the gentle composure, the self-command over her passionate sorrow, which gave to Ruth an unconscious grandeur of demeanour as she came up to the old servant. "Give him back to me, please. I did not know it brought ill luck, or if my heart broke I would not have let a tear drop on his face. I never will again. Thank you, Sally," as the servant relinquished him to her who came in the name of a mother. Sally watched Ruth's grave, sweet smile as she followed up Sally's play with the tassel, and imitated with all the docility inspired by love every movement and sound which had amused her babe. "Thou'lt be a mother after all," said Sally, with a kind of admiration of the control which Ruth was exercising over herself. "But why talk of heartbreaking? I don't question thee about what's past and gone; but now thou'rt wanting for nothing, nor thy child either. The time to come is the Lord's, and in His hands, and yet thou goest about a sighing and a moaning in a way that I can't stand or thole." "What do I do wrong?" said Ruth. "I try to do all I can." "Yes, in a way," said Sally, puzzled to know how to describe her meaning. "Thou dost it, but there's a right and a wrong way of setting about everything; and to my thinking, the right way is to take a thing up heartily. If it is only making a bed, why, dear, ah me! making a bed may be done after a Christian fashion, I take it, or else what's to come of such as me in heaven, who've had little enough time on earth for clapping ourselves down on our knees for set prayers? When I was a girl, and wretched enough about Master Thurstan, and the crook on his back which came of the fall I gave him, I took to praying and sighing, and giving up the world; and I thought it were wicked to care for the flesh, so I made heavy puddings, and was careless about dinner and the rooms, and thought I was doing my duty, though I did call myself a miserable sinner. But one night the old Mrs., Master Thurstan's mother, came in and sat down by me, as I was scolding myself, without thinking of what I was saying, and says she, 'Sally, what are you blaming yourself about, and groaning over? We hear you in the parlour every night, and it makes my heart ache.' 'Oh, ma'am,' says I, 'I'm a miserable sinner, and I'm travailing in the new birth.' 'Was that the reason,' says she, 'why the pudding was so heavy to day?' 'Oh, ma'am,' said I, 'if you would not think of the things of the flesh, but trouble yourself about your immortal soul.' And I sat a shaking my head to think about her soul. 'But,' says she, in her sweet dropping voice, I do try to think of my soul every hour of the day, if by that you mean trying to do the will of God. But we'll talk now about the pudding. Master Thurston could not eat it, and I know you'll be sorry for that." Well, I was sorry, but I didn't choose to say so, as she seemed to expect me. So I says, "It's a pity to see children brought up to care for things of the flesh." And then I could have bitten my tongue out, for the missus looked so grave, and I thought of my darling little lad pining for his want of his food. At last says she, "Sally, do you think God has put us into the world just to be selfish, and do nothing but see after our own souls, or to help one another with heart and hand, as Christ did to all who wanted help?" I was silent, for you see she puzzled me. So she went on. "What is that beautiful answer in your church catechism, Sally?" I was pleased to hear a dissenter, as I did not think would have done it, speak so knowledgeably about the catechism, and she went on, "To do my duty in that station of life unto which it shall please God to call me. Well, your station is a servant, and it is as honourable as a king's, if you look at it right, and you are to help and serve others in one way, just as a king is to help others in another. Now, what way are you to help and serve, or to do your duty in that station in life unto which it has pleased God to call you? Did it answer God's purpose and serve him when the food was unfit for a child to eat, and unwholesome for any one? Well, I would not give it up. I was so pig-headed about my soul. So says I wish folks would be content with locusts and wild honey, and leave other folks in peace to work out their salvation." And I groaned out pretty loud to think of Mrs. Soul. I often think, since she smiled a bit at me. But she said, "Well, Sally, to-morrow you shall have time to work out your salvation, but as we have no locusts in England, and I don't think they'd agree with Master Thurston if we had, I will come and make the pudding, but I shall try to do it well, not only for him to like it, because everything may be done in a right way or a wrong. The right way is to do it as well as we can, as in God's sight. The wrong is to do it in a self-seeking spirit, which either leads us to neglect it, to follow out some device of our own for our own ends, or to give up too much time and thought to it, both before and after the doing." Well, I thought of old Missis's words this morning, when I saw you making the beds. You sighed so, you could not half shake the pillows. Your heart was not in your work. And yet it was the duty God had set you, I reckon. I know it's not the work parsons preach about, though I don't think they go so far off the mark when they read, "Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, that do with all thy might." Just try for a day to think of all the odd jobs as to be done well and truly in God's sight, not just slurred over anyhow, and you'll go through them twice as cheerfully, and have no thought to spare for sighing or crying. Sally bustled off to set on the kettle for tea, and felt half ashamed, in the quiet of the kitchen, to think of the oration she had made in the parlour. But she saw with much satisfaction that henceforward Ruth nursed her boy with a vigour and cheerfulness that were reflected back from him, and the household work was no longer performed with a languid indifference, as if life and duty were distasteful. Miss Benson had her share in this improvement, though Sally placidly took all the credit to herself. One day, as she and Ruth sat together, Miss Benson spoke of the child, and thence went on to talk about her own childhood. By degrees they spoke of education, and the book learning that forms one part of it, and the result was that Ruth determined to get up early all through the bright summer mornings, to acquire the knowledge hereafter to be given her child. Her mind was uncultivated by reading scant. Beyond the mere mechanical arts of education she knew nothing, but she had a refined taste, and excellent sense and judgment to separate the true from the false. With these qualities she set to work under Mr. Benson's directions. She read in the early morning the books that he had marked out. She trained herself with strict perseverance to do all thoroughly. She did not attempt to acquire any foreign language, although her ambition was to learn Latin in order to teach it to her boy. Those summer mornings were happy, for she was learning neither to look backwards nor forwards, but to live faithfully and earnestly in the present. She rose while the hedge sparrow was yet singing his revel to his mate. She dressed and opened her window, shading the soft blowing air and the sunny eastern light from her baby. If she grew tired, she went and looked at him, and all her thoughts were holy prayers for him. Then she would gaze awhile out of the high upper window on to the moorlands that swelled in waves one behind the other in the grey cool morning light. These were her occasional relaxations, and after them she returned with strength to her work. End of chapter 16.
Chapter 17 of Ruth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Ruth by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 17. Leonard's Christening. In that body of dissenters to which Mr. Benson belonged, it is not considered necessary to baptize infants as early as the ceremony can be performed, and many circumstances concurred to cause the solemn thanksgiving and dedication of the child, for so these dissenters looked upon christenings, to be deferred until it was probably somewhere about 6 months old. There had been many conversations in the little sitting-room between the brother and sister and their protégé, which had consisted of questions betraying a thoughtful, wondering kind of ignorance on the part of Ruth, and answers more suggestive than explanatory from Mr. Benson, while Miss Benson kept up a kind of running commentary, always simple and often quaint, but with that intuition into the very heart of all things truly religious, which is often the gift of those who seem, at first sight, to be only affectionate and sensible. When Mr. Benson had explained his own view of what a christening ought to be considered, and, by calling out Ruth's latent feelings into pious earnestness, brought her into a right frame of mind, he felt that he had done what he could to make the ceremony more than a mere form, and to invest it, quiet, humble, and obscure as it must necessarily be in outward shape, mournful and anxious as many of its antecedents had rendered it, with the severe grandeur of an act done in faith and truth. It was not far to carry the little one, for, as I said, the chapel almost adjoined the minister's house. The whole procession was to have consisted of Mr. and Miss Benson, Ruth carrying her babe, and Sally, who felt herself, as a Church of England woman, to be condescending and kind in requesting leave to attend a baptism among them dissenters; but unless she had asked permission, she would not have been desired to attend, so careful was the habit of her master and mistress that she should be allowed that freedom which they claimed for themselves. But they were glad she wished to go. They liked the feeling that all were of one household, and that the interests of one were the interests of all. It produced a consequence, however, which they did not anticipate. Sally was full of the event which her presence was to sanction, and, as it were, to redeem from the character of being utterly schismatic. She spoke about it with an air of patronage,
to 3 or 4, and among them to some of the servants at Mr Bradshaw's. Miss Benson was rather surprised to receive a call from Jemima Bradshaw on the very morning of the day on which little Leonard was to be baptized. Miss Bradshaw was rosy and breathless with eagerness. Although the second in the family, she had been at school when her younger sisters had been christened, and she was now come, in the full warmth of a girl's fancy, to ask if she might be present at the afternoon service. She had been struck with Mrs Denbigh's grace and beauty at the very first sight, when she had accompanied her mother to call upon the Bensons on their return from Wales, and had kept up an enthusiastic interest in the widow, only a little older than herself, whose very reserve and retirement but added to her unconscious power of enchantment. "Oh, Miss Benson, I never saw a christening. Papa says I may go, if you think Mr Benson and Mrs Denbigh would not dislike it. And I will be quite quiet, and sit up behind the door, or anywhere. And that sweet little baby, I should so like to see him christened. Is he to be called Leonard, did you say? After Mr Denbigh, is it?" "No, not exactly," said Miss Benson, rather discomfited. "Was not Mr Denbigh's name Leonard, then? Mamma thought it would be sure to be called after him, and so did I. But I may come to the christening, may I not, dear Miss Benson?" Miss Benson gave her consent with a little inward reluctance. Both her brother and Ruth shared in this feeling, although no one expressed it, and it was presently forgotten. Jemima stood grave and quiet in the old-fashioned vestry adjoining the chapel, as they entered with steps subdued to slowness. She thought Ruth looked so pale and awed because she was left a solitary parent. But Ruth came to the presence of God as one who has gone astray, and doubted her own worthiness to be called His child. She came as a mother who had incurred a heavy responsibility, and who entreated His almighty aid to enable her to discharge it, full of passionate yearning love, which craved for more faith in God, to still her distrust and fear of the future that might hang over her darling. When she thought of her boy, she sickened and trembled; but when she heard of God's loving kindness, far beyond all tender mother's love, she was hushed into peace and prayer. There she stood, her fair, pale cheek resting on her baby's head as he slumbered on her bosom. Her eyes went slanting down under their half-closed white lids, but their gaze was not on the primitive cottage-like room. It was earnestly fixed on a dim mist, through which she fain would have seen the life that lay before her child. But the mist was still and dense, too thick a veil for anxious human love to penetrate. The future was hid with God. Mr Benson stood right under the casement window that was placed high up in the room. He was almost in shade, except for one or two marked lights which fell on hair already silvery white. His voice was always low and musical when he spoke to few. It was too weak to speak so as to be heard by many without becoming harsh and strange. But now it filled the little room with a loving sound, like the stock-dove's brooding murmur over her young. He and Ruth forgot all in their earnestness of thought, and when he said, "Let us pray," and the little congregation knelt down, you might have heard the baby's faint breathing, scarcely sighing out upon the stillness, so absorbed were all in the solemnity. But the prayer was long. Thought followed thought, and fear crowded upon fear, and all were to be laid bare before God, and His aid and counsel asked. Before the end, Sally had shuffled quietly out of the vestry into the green chapel yard, upon which the door opened. Miss Benson was alive to this movement, and so full of curiosity as to what it might mean, that she could no longer attend to her brother, and felt inclined to rush off and question Sally, the moment all was ended. Miss Bradshaw hung about the babe and Ruth, and begged to be allowed to carry the child home, but Ruth pressed him to her, as if there was no safe harbour for him but in his mother's breast. Mr Benson saw her feeling, and caught Miss Bradshaw's look of disappointment. "Come home with us," said he, "and stay to tea. You have never drunk tea with us since you went to school." "I wish I might," said Miss Bradshaw, colouring with pleasure, "but I must ask papa. May I run home and ask?" "To be sure, my dear." Jemima flew off, and fortunately her father was at home, for her mother's permission would have been deemed insufficient. She received many directions about her behaviour. "Take no sugar in your tea, Jemima. I am sure the Bensons ought not to be able to afford sugar with their means. And do not eat much. You can have plenty at home on your return. Remember, Mrs Denbigh's keep must cost them a great deal." So Jemima returned considerably sobered, and very much afraid of her hunger leading her to forget Mr Benson's poverty. Meanwhile, Miss Benson and Sally, acquainted with Mr Benson's invitation to Jemima, set about making some capital tea cakes, on which they piqued themselves. They both enjoyed the offices of hospitality, and were glad to place some homemade tempting dainty before their guests. "What made you leave the chapel vestry before my brother had ended?" inquired Miss Benson. "Indeed, ma'am, I thought the master had prayed so long he'd be drowsy, so I just slipped out to put on the kettle for tea." Miss Benson was on the point of reprimanding her for thinking of anything besides the object of the prayer, when she remembered how she herself had been unable to attend after Sally's departure, for wondering what had become of her, so she was silent. It was a disappointment to Miss Benson's kind and hospitable expectation when Jemima, as hungry as a hound, confined herself to one piece of the cake which her hostess had had such pleasure in making; and Jemima wished she had not a prophetic feeling all tea time of the manner in which her father would inquire into the particulars of the meal, elevating his eyebrows at every viand named beyond plain bread and butter, and winding up with some such sentence as this: "Well, I marvel how, with Benson's salary, he can afford to keep such a table." Sally could have told of self-denial when no one was by, when the left hand did not know what the right hand did, on the part of both her master and mistress, practised without thinking, even to themselves, that it was either a sacrifice or a virtue, in order to enable them to help those who were in need, or even to gratify Miss Benson's kind, old-fashioned feelings on such occasion as the present, when a stranger came to the house. Her homely, affectionate pleasure in making others comfortable might have shown that such little occasional extravagances were not waste, but a good work, and were not to be gauged by the standard of money spending. This evening her spirits were damped by Jemima's refusal to eat. Poor Jemima! The cakes were so good, and she was so hungry, but still she refused. While Sally was clearing away the tea things, Miss Benson and Jemima accompanied Ruth upstairs, when she went to put the little Leonard to bed. "A christening is a very solemn service," said Miss Bradshaw. "I had no idea it was so solemn. Mr Benson seemed to speak as if he had a weight of care on his heart that God alone could relieve or lighten." "My brother feels these things very much," said Miss Benson, rather wishing to cut short the conversation, for she had been aware of several parts in the prayer which she knew were suggested by the peculiarity and sadness of the case before him. "I could not quite follow him all through," continued Jemima. "What did he mean by saying, 'This child, rebuked by the world, and bidden to stand apart, thou wilt not rebuke, but wilt suffer it to come to thee, and be blessed with thine almighty blessing'? Why is this little darling to be rebuked? I do not think I remember the exact words, but he said something like that." "My dear, your gown is dripping wet. It must have dipped into the tub. Let me wring it out." "Oh, thank you! Never mind my gown," said Jemima hastily, and wanting to return to her question; but just then she caught the sight of tears falling fast down the cheeks of the silent Ruth, as she bent over her child, crowing and splashing away in his tub. With a sudden consciousness that unwittingly she had touched on some painful chord, Jemima rushed into another subject, and was eagerly seconded by Miss Benson. The circumstance seemed to die away, and leave no trace, but in after years it rose, vivid and significant, before Jemima's memory. At present it was enough for her if Mrs Denbigh would let her serve her in every possible way. Her admiration for beauty was keen, and little indulged at home, and Ruth was very beautiful in her quiet mournfulness. Her mean and homely dress left herself only the more open to admiration, for she gave it a charm by her unconscious wearing of it that made it seem like the drapery of an old Greek statue, subordinate to the figure it covered, yet imbued by it with an unspeakable grace. Then the pretended circumstances of her life were such as to catch the imagination of a young romantic girl. Altogether, Jemima could have kissed her hand and professed herself Ruth's slave. She moved away all the articles used at this little coucher. She folded up Leonard's day clothes. She felt only too much honoured when Ruth trusted him to her for a few minutes; only too amply rewarded when Ruth thanked her with a grave, sweet smile, and a grateful look of her loving eyes. When Jemima had gone away with the servant who was sent to fetch her, there was a little chorus of praise. "She's a warm-hearted girl," said Miss Benson. "She remembers all the old days before she went to school. She is worth 2 of Mr Richard. They're each of them just the same as they were when they were children, when they broke that window in the chapel, and he ran away home, and she came knocking at our door with a single knock, just like a beggar's, and I went to see who it was, and she was quite startled to see her round, brown, honest face looking up at me, half frightened, and telling me what she had done, and offering me the money in her savings bank to pay for it. We never should have heard of Master Richard's share in the business if it had not been for Sally." "But remember," said Miss Benson, "how strict Mr Bradshaw has always been with his children. It is no wonder if poor Richard was a coward in those days." "He is now, or I'm much mistaken," answered Miss Benson. "And Mr Bradshaw was just as strict with Jemima, and she's no coward. But I've no faith in Richard. He has a look about him that I don't like. And when Mr Bradshaw was away on business in Holland last year, for those months my young gentleman did not come hall as regularly to chapel, and I always believe that story of his being seen out with his hounds at Smithley's." "Those are neither of them great offences in a young man of 20," said Mr Benson, smiling. "No, I don't mind them in themselves; but when he could change back so easily to being regular and mim when his father came home, I don't like that." "Leonard shall never be afraid of me," said Ruth, following her own train of thought. "I will be his friend from the very first, and I will try and learn how to be a wise friend; and you will teach me, won't you, sir?" "What made you wish to call him Leonard, Ruth?" asked Miss Benson. "It was my mother's father's name, and she used to tell me about him and his goodness, and I thought if Leonard could be like him." "Do you remember the discussion there was about Miss Bradshaw's name, Thurston? Her father wanting her to be called Hepzibah, but insisting that she was to have a Scripture name at any rate, and Mrs Bradshaw wanting her to be called Juliana, after some novel she had read not long before, and at last Jemima was fixed upon, because it would do either for a Scripture name or a name for a heroine out of a book." "I did not know Jemima was a Scripture name," said Ruth. "Oh, yes, it is. One of Job's daughters, Jemima, Kezia, and Keren-Huppuch. There are a good many Jemimas in the world, and some Kezias, but I never heard of a Keren-Huppuch, and yet we know just as much of one as of another. People really like a pretty name, whether in Scripture or out of it, when there is no particular association with the name," said Mr Benson. "Now, I was called Faith after the cardinal virtue, and I like my name, though many people would think it too Puritan. That was according to our gentle mother's pious desire. And Thurston was called by his name because father wished it, for, although he was what people called a radical and a democrat in his ways of thinking and talking, he was very proud in his heart of being descended from old Sir Thurston, who figured away in the French wars. The difference between theory and practice, thinking and being," put in Mr Benson, who was in a mood for allowing himself a little social enjoyment. He leaned back in his chair, with his eyes looking at, but not seeing, the ceiling. Miss Benson was clicking away with her eternal knitting needles, looking at her brother, and seeing him too. Ruth was arranging her child's clothes against the morrow. It was but their usual way of spending an evening. The variety was given by the different tone which the conversation assumed on the different nights. Yet somehow the peacefulness of the time, the window open into the little garden, the scents that came stealing in, and the clear summer heaven above, made the time be remembered as a happy festival by Ruth. Even Sally seemed more placid than usual when she came into prayers, and she and Miss Benson followed Ruth to her bedroom, to look at the beautiful sleeping Leonard. "God bless him," said Miss Benson, stooping down to kiss his little dimpled hand, which lay outside the coverlet, tossed abroad in the heat of the evening. "Now, don't get up too early, Ruth. Injuring your health will be short-sighted wisdom and poor economy. Good night." "Good night, dear Miss Benson. Good night, Sally." When Ruth had shut her door, she went again to the bed, and looked at her boy till her eyes filled with tears. "God bless thee, darling. I only ask to be one of his instruments, and not thrown aside as useless, or worse than useless." So ended the day of Leonard's christening. Mr Benson had sometimes taught the children of different people as an especial favour, when requested by them. But then his pupils were only children, and by their progress he was little prepared for Ruth's. She had had early teaching of that kind which need never be unlearnt, from her mother, enough to unfold many of her powers. They had remained inactive now for several years, but had grown strong in the dark and quiet time. Her tutor was surprised at the bounds by which she surmounted obstacles, the quick perception and ready adaptation of truths and first principles, and her immediate sense of the fitness of things. Her delight in what was strong and beautiful called out her master's sympathy. But, most of all, he admired the complete unconsciousness of uncommon power, or unusual progress. It was less of a wonder than he considered it to be, it is true, for she never thought of comparing what she was now with her former self, much less with another. Indeed, she did not think of herself at all, but of her boy, and what she must learn in order to teach him to be and to do as suited her hope and her prayer. If anyone's devotion could have flattered her into self-consciousness, it was Jemima's. Mr Bradshaw never dreamed that his daughter could feel herself inferior to the minister's protégée, but so it was, and no knight-errant of old could consider himself more honoured by his lady's commands than did Jemima, if Ruth allowed her to do anything for her, or for the boy. Ruth loved her heartily, even while she was rather annoyed at the open expression Jemima used of admiration. "Please, I really would rather not be told if people do think me pretty." "But it was not merely beautiful, it was sweet-looking and good, Miss Postlethwaite called you," replied Jemima. "All the more I would rather not hear it. I may be pretty, but I know I am not good. Besides, I don't think we ought to hear what is said of us behind our backs." Ruth spoke so gravely that Jemima feared lest she was displeased. "Dear Mrs Denbigh, I will never admire or praise you again. Only let me love you." "And let me love you," said Ruth, with a tender kiss. Jemima would not have been allowed to come so frequently if Mr Bradshaw had not been possessed with the idea of patronising Ruth. If the latter had chosen, she might have gone dressed from head to foot in the presents which he wished to make her, but she refused them constantly, occasionally to Miss Benson's great annoyance. But if he could not load her with gifts, he could show his approbation by asking her to his house, and after some deliberation she consented to accompany Mr and Miss Benson there. The house was square and massy looking, with a great deal of drab colour about the furniture. Mrs Bradshaw, in her lackadaisical, sweet-tempered way, seconded her husband in his desire of being kind to Ruth, and as she cherished privately a great taste for what was beautiful or interesting, as opposed to her husband's love of the purely useful, this taste of hers had rarely had so healthy and true a mode of gratification as when she watched Ruth's movements about the room, which seemed in its obtrusiveness and poverty of colour to receive the requisite ornament of light and splendour from Ruth's presence. Mrs Bradshaw sighed, and wished she had a daughter as lovely, about whom to weave a romance, for castle building, after the manner of the Minerva Press, was the outlet by which she escaped from the pressure of her prosaic life as Mr Bradshaw's wife. Her perception was only of external beauty, and she was not always alive to that, or she might have seen how a warm, affectionate, ardent nature, free from all envy or carking care of self, gave an unspeakable charm to her plain, bright-faced daughter Jemima, whose dark eyes kept challenging admiration for her friend. The first evening spent at Mr Bradshaw's passed like many succeeding visits there. There was tea, the equipage for which was as handsome and as ugly as money could purchase. Then the ladies produced their sewing, while Mr Bradshaw stood before the fire, and gave the assembled party the benefit of his opinions on many subjects. The opinions were as good and excellent as the opinions of any man can be who sees one side of a case very strongly and almost ignores the other. They coincided in many points with those held by Mr Benson, but he once or twice interposed with a plea for those who might differ, and then he was heard by Mr Bradshaw with a kind of evident and indulgent pity, such as one feels for a child who unwittingly talks nonsense. By and by, Mrs Bradshaw and Miss Benson fell into one tete-a-tete, and Ruth and Jemima into another. Two well-behaved but unnaturally quiet children were sent to bed early in the evening, in an authoritative voice, by their father, because one of them had spoken too loud while he was enlarging on an alteration in the tariff. Just before the supper tray was brought in, a gentleman was announced whom Ruth had never previously seen, but who appeared well known to the rest of the party. It was Mr Farquhar, Mr Bradshaw's partner. He had been on the Continent for the last year, and had only recently returned. He seemed perfectly at home, but spoke little. He leaned back in his chair, screwed up his eyes, and watched everybody. Yet there was nothing unpleasant or unpertinent in his keenness of observation. Ruth wondered to hear him contradict Mr Bradshaw, and almost expected some rebuff; but Mr Bradshaw, if he did not yield the point, admitted for the first time that evening that it was possible something might be said on the other side. Mr Farquhar differed also from Mr Benson, but it was in a more respectful manner than Mr Bradshaw had done. For these reasons, although Mr Farquhar had never spoken to Ruth, she came away with the impression that he was a man to be respected and perhaps liked. Sally would have thought herself mightily aggrieved if, on their return, she had not heard some account of the evening. As soon as Miss Benson came in, the old servant began: "Well, and who was there? And what did they give you for supper?" "Only Mr Farquhar, besides ourselves, and sandwiches, sponge cake, and wine. There was no occasion for anything more," replied Miss Benson, who was tired, and preparing to go upstairs. "Mr Farquhar! Why, do they say he's thinking of Miss Jemima?" "Nonsense, Sally! Why, he's old enough to be her father," said Miss Benson, half way up the first flight. "There's no need for it to be called nonsense, though he may be 10 years older," muttered Sally, retreating towards the kitchen. "Bradshaw's Betsy knows what she's about, and wouldn't have said it for nothing." Ruth wondered a little about it. She loved Jemima well enough to be interested in what related to her, but after thinking for a few minutes, she decided that such a marriage was, and would ever be, very unlikely. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Ruth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Ruth by Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 18. Ruth becomes a governess in Mr Bradshaw's family. One afternoon, not long after this, Mr and Miss Benson set off to call upon a farmer who attended the chapel, but lived at some distance from the town. They intended to stay to tea if they were invited, and Ruth and Sally were left to spend a long afternoon together. At first, Sally was busy in her kitchen, and Ruth employed herself in carrying her baby out into the garden. It was now nearly a year since she came to the Bensons. It seemed like yesterday, and yet as if a lifetime had gone between. The flowers were budding now, that were all in bloom when she came down, on the first autumnal morning, into the sunny parlour. The yellow jessamine, that was then a tender plant, had now taken firm root in the soil, and was sending out strong roots. The wallflowers, which Miss Benson had sown on the wall a day or two after her arrival, were scenting the air with their fragrant flowers. Ruth knew every plant now. It seemed as though she had always lived here, and always known the inhabitants of the house. She heard Sally singing her accustomed song in the kitchen, a song she never varied, over her afternoon's work.
it began, "As I was going to Derby, sir, upon a market day." And if music is a necessary element in a song, perhaps I had better call it by some other name. But the strange change was in Ruth herself. She was conscious of it, though she could not define it, and did not dwell upon it. Life had become significant and full of duty to her. She delighted in the exercise of her intellectual powers, and liked the idea of the infinite amount of which she was ignorant, for it was a grand pleasure to learn, to crave, and be satisfied. She strove to forget what had gone before this last 12 months. She shuddered up from contemplating it. It was like a bad, unholy dream. And yet there was a strange, yearning kind of love for the father of the child whom she pressed to her heart, which came, and she could not bid it begone as sinful, it was so pure and natural, even when thinking of it as in the sight of God. Little Leonard cooed to the flowers, and stretched after their bright colours, and Ruth laid him on the dry turf, and pelted him with the gay petals. He chinked and crowed with laughing delight, and clutched at her cap, and pulled it off. Her short rich curls were golden brown in the slanting sunlight, and by their very shortness made her more childlike. She hardly seemed as if she could be the mother of the noble babe over whom she knelt, now snatching kisses, now matching his cheek with rose leaves. All at once the bells of the old church struck the hour, and far away, high up in the air, began slowly to play the old tune of "Life let us cherish." They had played it for years, for the life of man, and it always sounded fresh, and strange, and aerial. Ruth was still in a moment, she knew not why, and the tears came into her eyes as she listened. When it was ended, she kissed her baby, and bade God bless him. Just then Sally came out, dressed for the evening, with a leisurely look about her. She had done her work, and she and Ruth were to drink tea together in the exquisitely clean kitchen. But while the kettle was boiling, she came out to enjoy the flowers. She gathered a piece of southern wood, and stuffed it up her nose by way of smelling it. "What do you call this in your country?" asked she. "Old man," replied Ruth. "We call it here lad's love. It and peppermint drops always reminds me of going to church in the country. Here, I'll get you a black currant leaf to put in the teapot. It gives it a flavour. We had bees once against this wall, but when Missus died, we forgot to tell 'em and put 'em in mourning, and, in course, they swarmed away without our knowing, and the next winter came a hard frost, and they died. Now, I dare say, the water will be boiling, and it's time for little master there to come in, for the dew is falling. See, all the daisies is shutting themselves up." Sally was most gracious as a hostess. She quite put on her company manners to receive Ruth in the kitchen. They laid Leonard to sleep on the sofa in the parlour, that they might hear him the more easily, and then they sat quietly down to their sewing by the bright kitchen fire. Sally was, as usual, the talker, and, as usual, the subject was the family of whom for so many years she had formed a part. "Aye, things was different when I was a girl," quoth she. "Eggs was 30 for a shilling, and butter only 6d. a pound. My wage when I came here was but £3, and I did on it, and was always clean and tidy, which is more than many a lass can say who now gets £7 and £8 a year. And tea was kept for an afternoon drink, and pudding was eaten afore meat in them days. And the upshot was, people paid their debts better. Aye, aye, we're gone backwards, we thinking we're gone forwards." After shaking her head a little over the degeneracy of the times, Sally returned to a part of the subject on which she thought she had given Ruth a wrong idea. "You'll not go for to think now that I've not more than £3 a year. I've a deal above that now. First of all
old missus gave me £4, for she said I were worth it, and I thought in my heart that I were, so I took it without more ado. But after her death, Master Thurston and Miss Faith took a fit of spending, and says they to me, one day, as I carried tea in, 'Sally, we think your wages ought to be raised.' 'What matter what you think?' said I, pretty sharp, for I thought they'd ha' shown more respect to missus if they let things stand as they were in her time, and they'd gone and moved the sofa away from the wall to where it stands now, already that very day. So I speaks up sharp, and says I, 'As long as I'm content, I think it's no business of yours to be meddling with me and my money matters.' 'But,' says Miss Faith, she's always the one to speak first, if you'll notice, though it's master that comes in and clinches the matter with some reason she'd never have thought of. He were always a sensible lad. 'Sally, all the servants in the town have £6 and better, and you have as hard a place as any of 'em. Did you ever hear me grumble about my work, that you talk about it in that way? Wait till I grumble,' says I, 'but don't meddle with me till then.' So I flung off in a huff, but in the course of the evening Master Thurston came in and sat down in the kitchen, and he's such winning ways, he whiles one over to anything, and besides, a notion had come into my head. Now you'll not tell," said she, glancing round the room, and hitching up her chair nearer to Ruth in a confidential manner. Ruth promised, and Sally went on. "I thought I should like to be an heiress with money, and leave it all to master and Miss Faith. And I thought if I'd £6 a year, I could, maybe, get to be an heiress. All I was feared on was that some chap or other might marry me for my money, but I've managed to keep the fellows off. So I looks mim and grateful, and I thanks Master Thurston for his offer, and I take the wages. And what do you think I've done?" asked Sally, with an exultant air. "What have you done?" asked Ruth. "Why," replied Sally, slowly and emphatically, "I've saved £30, but that's not it. I've gotten a lawyer to make me a will. That's it, wench," said she, slapping Ruth on the back. "How did you manage it?" asked Ruth. "Aye, that was it," said Sally. "I thought about it many a night before I hit on the right way. I was afeard the money might be thrown into Chancery if I didn't make it all safe. Yet I could not ask Master Thurston. At last, and at length, John Jackson, the grocer, had a neighbour come to stay a week with him, as was 'prentice to a lawyer in Liverpool. So now was my time, and here was my lawyer. Wait a minute, I could tell you my story better if I had my will in my hand, and I'll scumfish you if ever you go for to tell." She held up her hand and threatened Ruth as she left the kitchen to fetch the will. When she came back, she brought a parcel tied up in a blue pocket handkerchief. She sat down, squared her knees, untied the handkerchief, and displayed a small piece of parchment. "Now, do you know what this is?" said she, holding it up. "It's parchment, and it's the right stuff to make wills on. People gets into Chancery if they don't make them of this stuff, and I reckon Tom Jackson thought he'd have a fresh job on it if he could get it into Chancery, for the rascal went and wrote it on a piece of paper at first, and came and read it me out loud off a piece of paper no better than what one writes letters upon. I were up to him, and thinks I, 'Come, come, my lad, I'm not a fool, though you may think so. I know a piece of paper won't stand, but I'll let you run your rig.' So I sits and I listens, and would you believe me, he read it out as if it were clear a business as you're giving me that thimble. No more ado, though it were £30, I could understand it myself. That were no law for me. I wanted summat to consider about, and for the meaning to be wrapped up as I wrap up my best gown. So I says, 'Tom, it's not on parchment. I must have it on parchment.' 'This'll do as well,' says he. 'We'll get it witnessed, and it will stand good.' Well, I liked the notion of having it witnessed, and for a while that soothed me, but after a bit I felt I should like it done according to law, and not plain out as anybody might have done it, I myself, if I could have written. So I says, 'Tom, I must have it on parchment.' 'Parchment costs money,' says he, very grave. 'Oh, my lad, are ye there?' thinks I. 'That's the reason I'm clipped of law.' So says I, 'Tom, I must have it on parchment. I'll pay the money and welcome. It's £30, and what can I lay to it? I'll make it safe. It shall be on parchment, and I'll tell thee what, lad, I'll give ye sixpence for every good law word you put in it, sounding like, and not to be caught up as a person runs. Your master had need to be ashamed of you as an apprentice, if you can't do a thing more tradesmanlike than this.' Well, he laughed above a bit, but I were firm and stood to it. So he made it out on parchment. 'Now, woman, try and read it,' says she, giving it to Ruth. Ruth smiled and began to read. Sally listened with rapt attention. When Ruth came to the word testatrix, Sally stopped her. 'That was the first sixpence,' said she. 'I thought he was going to fob me off again with plain language, but when that word came, I out with my sixpence and gave it to him on the spot. Now go on.' Presently Ruth read, 'accruing.' 'That was the second sixpence. 4 sixpences it were in all, besides 6 and 8pence as we bargained at first, and 3 and 4pence parchment. There, that's what I call a will, witnessed according to law, and all. Master Thurstan will be prettily taken in when I die, and he finds all his extra wage left back to him. But it will teach him it's not so easy as he thinks for, to make a woman give up her way.' The time was now drawing near when little Leonard might be weaned, the time appointed by all three for Ruth to endeavour to support herself in some way more or less independent of Mr. and Miss Benson. This prospect dwelt much in all of their minds, and was in each shaded with some degree of perplexity, but they none of them spoke of it for fear of accelerating the event. If they had felt clear and determined as to the best course to be pursued, they were none of them deficient in courage to commence upon that course at once. Miss Benson would, perhaps, have objected the most to any alteration in their present daily mode of life, but that was because she had the habit of speaking out her thoughts as they arose, and she particularly disliked and dreaded change. Besides this, she had felt her heart open out and warm towards the little helpless child in a strong and powerful manner. Nature had intended her warm instincts to find vent in a mother's duties. Her heart had yearned after children, and made her restless in her childless state, without her well knowing why. But now the delight she experienced in tending, nursing, and contriving for the little boy, even contriving to the point of sacrificing many of her cherished whims, made her happy and satisfied and peaceful. It was more difficult to sacrifice her whims than her comforts, but all had been given up when and where required by the sweet lordly baby, who reigned paramount in his very helplessness. From some cause or other, an exchange of ministers for one Sunday was to be effected with a neighbouring congregation, and Mr. Benson went on a short absence from home. When he returned on Monday, he was met at the house door by his sister, who had evidently been looking out for him for some time. She stepped out to greet him. "Don't hurry yourself, Thurstan. All's well. Only I wanted to tell you something. Don't fidget yourself. Baby is quite well, bless him. It's only good news. Come into your room and let me talk a little quietly with you." She drew him into his study, which was near the outer door, and then she took off his coat, and put his carpet bag in a corner, and wheeled a chair to the fire, before she would begin. "Well, now, to think how often things fall out just as we want them, Thurstan. Have you not often wondered what was to be done with Ruth when the time came at which we promised her she should earn her living? I am sure you have, because I have so often thought about it myself, and yet I never dared to speak out my fear, because that seemed giving it a shape. And now Mr Bradshaw has put all to rights. He invited Mr Jackson to dinner yesterday, just as we were going into chapel, and then he turned to me and asked me if I would come to tea, straight from afternoon chapel, because Mrs Bradshaw wanted to speak to me. He made it very clear I was not to bring Ruth, and indeed she was only too happy to stay home with baby. And so I went, and Mrs Bradshaw took me into her bedroom, and shut the doors, and said Mr Bradshaw had told her that he did not like Jemima being so much confined with the younger ones while they were at their lessons, and that he wanted someone above a nursemaid to sit with them while their masters were there, someone who would see about their learning their lessons, and who would walk out with them, a sort of nursery governess, I think she meant, though she did not say so. And Mr Bradshaw, for of course I saw his thoughts and words constantly peeping out, though he had told her to speak to me, believed that our Ruth would be the very person. Now, Thurstan, don't look so surprised, as if she had never come into your head. I am sure I saw what Mrs Bradshaw was driving at, long before she came to the point, and I could scarcely keep from smiling and saying, 'We jump at the proposal,' long before I ought to have known anything about it." "Oh, I wonder what we ought to do," said Mr Benson. "Or rather, I believe I see what we ought to do, if I durst but do it." "Why, what ought we to do?" asked his sister in surprise. "I ought to go and tell Mr Bradshaw the whole story." "And get Ruth turned out of our house?" said Miss Benson indignantly. "They can't make us do that," said her brother. "I do not think they would try." "Yes, Mr Bradshaw would try, and he would blazon out poor Ruth's sin, and there would not be a chance for her left. I know him well, Thurstan, and why should he be told now, more than a year ago?" "A year ago he did not want to put her in a situation of trust about his children." "And you think she'll abuse that trust, do you? You've lived a 12-month in the house with Ruth, and the end of it is you think she will do his children harm. Besides, who encouraged Jemima to come to the house so much to see Ruth? Did you not say it would do them both good to see something of each other?" Mr Benson sat thinking. "If you had not known Ruth as well as you do, if, during her stay with us, you had marked anything wrong, or forward, or deceitful, or immodest, I would say at once, 'Don't allow Mr Bradshaw to take her into his house.' But still I would say, 'Don't tell of her sin and sorrow to so severe a man, so unpitiful a judge.' But here, I ask you, Thurstan, can you, or I, or Sally, quick-eyed as she is, say that in any one thing we have had true, just occasion to find fault with Ruth? I don't mean that she is perfect. She acts without thinking. Her temper is sometimes warm and hasty. But have we any right to go and injure her prospects for life by telling Mr Bradshaw all we know of her errors, only 16 when she did so wrong, and never to escape from it all her many years to come, to have the despair which would arise from its being known, clutching her back into worse sin? What harm do you think she can do? What is the risk to which you think you are exposing Mr Bradshaw's children?" She paused, out of breath, her eyes glittering with tears of indignation, and impatient for an answer that she might knock it to pieces. "I do not see any danger that can arise," said he at length, and with slow difficulty, as if not fully convinced. "I have watched Ruth, and I believe she is pure and truthful, and the very sorrow and penitence she has felt, the very suffering she has gone through, has given her a thoughtful conscientiousness beyond her age. That and the care of her baby," said Miss Benson, secretly delighted at the tone of her brother's thoughts. "Ah, Faith, that baby you so much dreaded once, is turning out a blessing, you see," said Thurston, with a faint, quiet smile. "Yes, any one might be thankful, and better too, for Leonard. But how could I tell that it would be like him? But to return to Ruth and Mr Bradshaw. What did you say?" "Oh, with my feelings, of course. I was only too glad to accept the proposal, and so I told Mrs Bradshaw then, and I afterwards repeated it to Mr Bradshaw when he asked me if his wife had mentioned their plans. They would understand that I must consult you and Ruth before it could be considered as finally settled." "And have you named it to her?" "Yes," answered Miss Benson, half afraid lest he should think she had been too precipitate. "And what did she say?" asked he, after a little pause of grave silence. "At first she seemed very glad, and fell into my mood of planning how it should all be managed, how Sally and I should take care of the baby the hours that she was away at Mr Bradshaw's; but by and by she became silent and thoughtful, and knelt down by me, and hid her face in my lap, and shook a little as if she was crying, and then I heard her speak in a very low, smothered voice, for her head was still bent down, quite hanging down indeed, so that I could not see her face. So I stooped to listen, and I heard her say, 'Do you think I should be good enough to teach little girls, Miss Benson?' She said it so humbly and fearfully that all I thought of was how to cheer her, and I answered and asked her if she did not hope to be good enough to bring up her own darling to be a brave Christian man. And she lifted up her head, and I saw her eyes looking wild and wet and earnest, and she said, 'With God's help, that will I try to make my child.' And then I said, 'Ruth, as you strive and as you pray for your own child, you must strive and pray to make Mary and Elizabeth good, if you are trusted with them.' And she said quite clear, though her face was hidden from me once more, 'I will strive, and I will pray.' You would not have any fears, Thurston, if you could have heard and seen her last night." "I have no fear," said he decidedly. "Let the plan go on." After a minute he added, "But I am glad it was so far arranged before I heard of it. My indecision about right and wrong, my perplexity about how far we are to calculate consequences, grows upon me, I fear." "You look tired and weary, dear. You should blame your body rather than your conscience at these times." "A very dangerous doctrine." The scroll of fate was closed, and they could not foresee the future; and yet, if they could have seen it, though they might have shrunk fearfully at first, they would have smiled and thanked God when all was done and said. Chapter 19.